Hello everyone, this is Professor Benjamin and this is our weekly roundup. We have made it through week 9 of this course and we're headed into week 10. So all that's left this semester is we're going to cover water this week. Next week we're going to cover non-renewable, and then we're going to cover renewable, and then it's the final exam. You do have some time frame in there to study or prepare for the final exam, so I want to make sure that you have that available time. As always, a couple housekeeping items that I want to go over before we begin the roundup of population. So this week we will cover water as always. An initial post is due by Tuesday, a response post is due by Thursday, and you'll have your weekly quiz by Sunday every week. So don't forget your population quiz that is due by Sunday, November, today's the 8th, 9th, 10th by 11:59. Okay. Another thing that I want to show you is that I have posted, there is of course the final exam review, which is right here under population, but also you can find the final exam review sheet right here under the final exam module. And you will also see a walkthrough video I made of the final exam. So I walk you through the questions on the final exam, just give you a little tidbits, read the question aloud, etc. So if you have questions with that, you want to reach out before the final exam. The other housekeeping item is that for non-renewable energy, you do have to watch the film Gasland, so I highly suggest that you acquire the film now, because you'll see on the final exam that there's a question that relates to the film Gasland. So make sure you start acquiring that film now so that when the week comes, you'll have the film or you have watched it already, so that you can formulate your answers for both the discussion posts and start preparing for that question that you'll see on the final exam about the film. Okay, so there are housekeeping items. Let's get that off the table, and now we will cover population. So this week there were two major topics that you're going to find on your final exam that we went over, and both of them were forum post questions. So let's walk through those. One of them had to do with the One China Child policy. And if you look through the PowerPoint slides, you'll see that managing population is very difficult, and because, remember, under the Tragedy of the Commons article, the UN cannot regulate population growth. There is no way they can say you can only have one child and you can only have two children. They cannot do that. It is an infringement upon every human's right. And so right in the Tragedy of the Commons article by Garrett Hardin that you can find under Session 2, you'll actually find that statement from the UN. So the only way we can manage population is through mutual corrosion, which Hardin talks about in his article, which is through taxation, through corrosion of some sort, meaning we implement birth control or we implement educational routes. So there are ways that we can curb population growth, but we cannot say you cannot have more children. So China in 1979 enacted what they call the One China Child Policy Act. So they knew their population was going to explode. They had so many individuals at prime fertility rate in the country that they said, oh, we have to do something about that. So they implemented the One China Child Policy. And the One China Child Policy said that if you had a disabled child, then you could have, in the cities, if you had a disabled child, you could have another child right away. You could have a second child. The other thing it said is if you wanted to have more than one child, you would be taxed. In the rural areas, same thing, you would be taxed if you had more than one child. If you had a girl first, you would have to, or if you had a child, you would have to wait 5 years till the next child. If you had a girl first, you would only have to wait 5 years. If you had a boy, then you would have to wait 10 years to have your second child. So they put these restrictions in place, and that was to curb population growth. But they didn't think about all the social consequences that were going to come about because of those restrictions. And the big things that you need to know about Chinese culture is, number one, first of all, their political structure is a communist country. Second of all, their culture is that they, of course, look at boys with more importance. And the reason for that is, number one, they carry on the family name. Number two, especially in rural areas, they provide free labor. The other thing is that they actually are the social security system in China, meaning that boys, when they get older and marry, their parents live with them. So they are the form of social security system in China. They don't get a check. Like in the United States, you get a social security check when you reach a certain age. Rather, in China, the son is responsible for taking care of his parents. So because of those things, families wanted to have boys because, of course, there were a lot of cultural constraints. But this led to many social consequences. The first one it led to was sex-selective abortion, meaning that if you had first of all, abortion while in womb, meaning that they did make ultrasounds illegal to find out the sex of a baby, but still there was an illegal market for having an ultrasound and, of course, having an abortion if you're carrying a girl. The other thing is that there were a lot of infant girls that were killed at birth. So they would birth the babies and the hospital would actually kill them upon request from the parents. About 10 years ago, maybe even less than that, they found a huge hospital bag of babies that were found floating in a river in China that had the hospital logo on it, and they could trace it right back to the hospital. And they were all females. And that is because the parents said, listen, like, we don't want a girl first because then we can't have another boy, or we're going to be heavily taxed and we don't have the money to do that, and we need a boy. And so that led to that. So sex-selective abortion is one of the major social consequences. Another thing is that a lot of these females were born and then they were just left on the roadsides or given up for adoption. And now China is overrun with orphanages that have girls in them. So a significant amount of girls, and the Chinese government has to pay for this care. So that was one of the social consequences. Is here they are trying to curb population growth, but they still have all these girls that they have to care for, and now the government has to pay to take care of them. So there's a huge market for foster care parents, and there has also been a treaty set up with the United States where female Chinese girls are easily adopted into the United States. There's less paperwork. It's not as expensive as actually adopting U.S. citizen babies. And so you'll actually see an influx of girls being adopted from China and the United States. And that's the reason why. Okay. Another thing is, of course, the sex ratio. So now there's all these boys and not enough girls. Okay. And that has led to a crisis in terms of marrying. Number one, there's not enough girls to go around, which has now created a market of sex trade, meaning that there is now illegal human trafficking. So girls are being kidnapped in places like North Korea and being shipped to China to marry off. Young girls are being stolen from their villages and being sold off to men to marry and have children. So there's a whole nother social consequence that China did not realize. The other thing is that there were a lot of girls that were hidden in their villages. So they were born, their parents hid them in the villages, they did not get their paperwork, and now all of these girls are coming forward, and it would be as if one of us did not have a social security card. So they're coming forward and saying, I exist, but I don't have a social security card. So that's another social consequence. Another one of the last social consequences that I'm going to go over is the economy. China wants to grow its economy and its manufacturing sectors, which they already have a large sector in that, but they want to grow even further to become a developed country. The problem is now they have such a have such a small workforce that they can't contribute to those economic growths that they want to have because they put these checks and balances in population growth. So there is a bunch of social consequences that you can discuss on the final exam. The other thing that I want to touch on that we covered this week is the idea of that carrying capacity line and population, is that we've seen exponential growth in the human population, and we are almost to the point where we might overshoot the carrying capacity line. A lot of people say the carrying capacity line, which is the amount of resources that we need to support a sustainable human life, is about 10 billion. And we're getting really close to that. We're at about 7.5 to 7.8 billion now, people in the world, and we've gotten to that point. We've moved from 7 to 7.8 or 7.5 in about 8 years. So imagine that will happen in our lifetime, where we'll probably reach 10 billion people. And a lot of economists and environmentalists say that that's the line that we're going to then start to see really big crunches on our resources. And so we need to make sure that we stay below that carrying capacity line, so that we do not have a shortage of resources like fresh water or food or other things to support human life. We may see a dieback at some point, meaning a virus comes into effect or some sort of disease, a virus, but we could also see some sort of other disease that comes in and kills a large portion of the human population before we reach the carrying capacity line, because of checks and balances in nature, but we may not. And so those are two major questions that you're going to see on your final exam that I wanted to address in this week's roundup. Okay, so don't forget, next week we're going to cover water. And we have a couple questions on the final exam about water. So if you want to look at the final exam review and type out some of those answers as you answer the forum post questions this week, that will, of course, help you prepare for your final exam. So again, you have your initial post due by Tuesday for water, response post due by Thursday, quiz due by Sunday, November 17th, and of course, do not forget your population quiz that is due by November 10th. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, and I look forward to your forum posts this week.